Welcome to Lecture 5, Ethics in Psychological Research. So far in the class, we've learned about the qualities of good research in psychology. We've learned about some basic research designs. So last lecture we talked about descriptive research versus correlational research versus experimental research. Regardless of how you run your study, what type of study you run, you have to run your study ethically. That's very important in psychology because we're typically dealing with human participants. So today we'll discuss how to conduct ethical research, starting with a very famous social psychology experiment that arguably was not ethically run. This lecture is based on Module 2.3 in your textbook. So we're going to start by discussing an experiment run by Stanley Milgram, who was a social psychologist at Yale University in the 1960s. And Milgram conducted a very famous study that you may have heard about, looking at obedience to authority in adult men. So this study was run about 15 years after the end of World War II, and at the time the Nuremberg trials were happening. So these were the trials in which political and military leaders in Nazi Germany were being tried for war crimes. And a common defense for the atrocities that they committed was that they were simply following orders. They had been told to do these terrible things, and so it wasn't their fault. They were just following orders. And Milgram wanted to study this obedience to authority in the laboratory. So he designed a study that has since become quite famous. He recruited men between the ages of 20 and 50. Participants were paid $4 an hour, which was a fair amount at the time. The image on the slide shows a picture of Milgram, and the chart gives a breakdown of who his participants were, so what their occupations were and how old they were. Now, Milgram's experiment is actually rather complicated. It involves 3 people: an experimenter, a teacher, and a learner. And the experiment actually starts with a deception. So Milgram tells his participants that they've been randomly assigned to be the teacher, when in fact every single participant in the study is always the teacher. The learners are confederates. So that means they're in on the deception. They're other experimenters. Now, the participants thought that the learners were other participants, so just other people that Milgram had recruited for the experiment. And so the role of the teacher, of the participant, was to quiz the learner on a list of word pairs read at the start of the experiment. So at the start of the experiment, the participant read to the learner a list of word pairs: apple, car, yellow, bird, and the participant's job was to later quiz the learner on these word pairs to see, as Milgram told the participant, how much the learner could remember. And so Milgram initially explained the purpose of the study to participants as being about the effect of punishment on memory of word pairs. And the punishment in this case was a shock. So when the learner made a mistake, the experimenter instructed the participant to deliver a shock to the learner. Now, these shocks were initially small, but the voltage was increased in 15-volt increments for each wrong answer. So imagine you're a participant in this study. You've been told that you've been randomly assigned to the role of the teacher, and you're quizzing the learner, and every time the learner makes a mistake, you have to deliver a shock to the learner. And these shocks go up. They increase in strength incrementally. And the learner starts making mistakes. And after a point, the shocks actually become painful. And the learner cries out, "It hurts. Let me out of here." Now, if you heard that and you wanted to stop, the experimenter would actually respond with a rehearsed series of verbal commands. So the first command, if you asked to stop, was "please continue." The next command was "the experiment requires that you continue." The next command was "it is absolutely essential that you continue." And the final and fourth command was "you have no other choice. You must go on." So you're asking to stop and you're being confronted with these commands telling you that you have to continue to deliver shocks to the learner. So as I said at the start, the learner was in on the study, and in this case there actually were no shocks. The true aim was to see how far participants would go. Would participants deliver painful shocks just because they were being told to? So there's actually some really nice footage of this study on YouTube. There's a whole documentary on it. And I've taken a clip from that documentary and I'm going to play it for you now. It should give you a sense of how the experiment works, because it is admittedly sort of a complicated experiment. And what I'm going to ask you to do is just pay attention to the participant. Do you think that the participant looks like he's enjoying himself, or does it seem like he's under some amount of stress?
150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue. The next word is sad.
Want me to keep going?
Continue, please.
Oh, sad. Sad. Face, music, clown, girl. Correct. Next one, short. Sentence, movie, skirt, time. Answer, please. Wrong. Under 65 volts. Time.
Let me out.
That guy's hollering in there.
Continue, please. Go on.
There's a lot of them here, you know. They have a heart condition down. You want me to go?
Just continue, please.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Answer, please. Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it now. I'm not gonna kill that man. There. You hear him hollering? He's
As I said
crying.
before, the shocks may be painful, but
Yeah,
they're not
but he's in
dangerous.
there hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I
pairs.
refuse to take the responsibility of getting hurt in there. I'm not. I mean, he's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and I mean, geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. Answer, please. Wrong. 195 volts. Dance.
Let me out of
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me
I
out.
mean, you see,
Let
he's
me out of
hollering
here. Let
there.
me out. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out. Let me out.
You know, I mean, gee, I don't know.
Well, the experiment requires
Well,
that
I
you
mean,
continue.
I know it does, sir, but I mean, you don't know what he's getting in for. He's up to 195 volts. Answer, please. Wrong. 225 volts. The word is noise. New. House pet book name. Answer, please. Correct. Next one, quiet. Song, party, child, evening. Correct.
So when I watch that clip, what I take away from it is that it's pretty clear that Milgram's deception has put the participant under severe stress. The man looks quite uncomfortable with what he's being asked to do. Now, in Milgram's first experiment, 65% of participants delivered the maximum shock, so they went all the way up to 450 volts in this case. At the end of the study, the deception was revealed. Many participants were actually glad that they had participated. Now, we can talk about what this means. What does this result mean? Does it actually provide evidence for the notion that we are obedient to authority? This view is controversial. There were many different conditions actually in Milgram's experiment. In one case, for instance, the participant was actually in the room with the learner, and when you're in the room with the learner, you don't tend to deliver the maximum shock. The podcast Radiolab has a really good rundown of this experiment. I've linked to it at the end of this lecture. And so if you're interested in what the result actually means for obedience, I recommend that you listen to that. But the reason why I've introduced this study is to talk about the ethics of it. And so what I'd like you to do is think about the ethics of this experiment. And from an ethical perspective, are there any problems with Milgram's study that you can think of? So take about 30 seconds to jot down 2 to 3 problems with his study that come to mind based on what you've just seen. So the first problem that comes to mind when I think about the study is that it involved deception. So Milgram told his participants that the aim of the study was to measure the impact of punishment on learning, when really it was about obedience to authority. Now, we do run psychology experiments today that involve deception, but the key is that that deception shouldn't cause harm. And so in this case, Milgram's deception put his participants under stress, which leads to problem 2. This study had clear risks, right? Severe stress has a negative impact on your health. It can lead to long-term consequences like post-traumatic stress disorder. The third major problem that comes to mind when I think about this study is that participants were pressured to continue. So when they asked to stop, they weren't allowed to stop. They were told that they must go on. The experiment depended on them. The results depended on them. Now, this would never happen today. You would never pressure a participant to continue doing a study that he or she doesn't want to continue doing. So how do we avoid designing an ethically dubious study like this? How do we ensure that our psychology studies are conducted ethically? Well, there are at least three things that we need to consider. So first of all, we have to weigh the risks and benefits. So if the study has risks, if we are putting people under stress, do the benefits outweigh these risks? And so typically, the benefit would be the gain in knowledge. We also have to make sure that we get informed consent from our participants. So our participants should know roughly what the study is about and what they're going to have to do, and they should give their consent to participate, and that consent is ongoing. So when they ask to stop, we have to let them stop. And finally, we should guarantee anonymity and confidentiality. And we've discussed this in previous lectures in relation to eliminating both participant and researcher bias. So who weighs the risks and benefits of psychology experiments? Well, it's not the experimenters. There are research ethics boards at most universities who review proposals for experiments and decide whether the proposed experiment is ethically sound. Physical risks are pretty rare in psychology experiments, so it's pretty rare to put somebody under physical stress. Psychological risks are more common in psychology experiments. So you could imagine, for instance, making people aware of their own death. This is called mortality salience. Somebody in our department actually studies this. Or having people relive traumatic experiences. And so if you want to do a study that examines mortality salience, you have to make your case to the Research Ethics Board. And you have to provide evidence that the benefit of doing the study outweighs the risk of possibly making people feel uncomfortable. We have to make sure that volunteers are actually volunteers, so we can't coerce people into doing our experiments. We also have to get informed consent. So before participants do an experiment, they must be told the general purpose of the study, why they're being invited to participate, what the study will involve, the risks and benefits, and the steps that we've taken as experimenters to minimize risk. Once they have this information, the researcher must ensure that participants give their unbiased consent, and the key here is that this consent is ongoing and it can be withdrawn at any time. So at any point in an experiment, participants can say, I've had enough, I'd like to stop, and the experiment is over. At the end of studies, we debrief participants. We tell participants what the experiment was about and what we plan to do with the data. Finally, we guarantee anonymity and confidentiality. So there should be no way to connect collected data to individual participants. Not only is providing anonymity and confidentiality the ethical thing to do, but as we've discussed in prior lectures, it can lead to less biased and more truthful responses from participants. Participants might feel pressure to respond in a certain way if they know that they can be identified. Now, as experimenters, we also have an ethical responsibility to accurately collect and report our data, right? So we can't fabricate data, we can't make data up. We have to report truthfully what happened. Sometimes this doesn't happen. One famous case of scientific misconduct was conducted by Andrew Wakefield, a British physician. He published a paper in a very famous medical journal known as The Lancet, and this paper claimed to link autism to the MMR vaccine. Now, MMR stands for mumps, measles, and rubella. This is a vaccine that most of us have probably had as young children. Wakefield's finding was based on 12 cases, and it has never been replicated. So nobody has ever found any other evidence linking vaccines to autism. It was later revealed that Wakefield was biased. He was a paid consultant for attorneys suing vaccine producers. So there was a financial incentive for him to find this result. And again, this result has never been replicated. There's really no evidence linking vaccines to autism. Unfortunately, this case of scientific misconduct fueled an anti-vaccination movement that has grown and has led to a rebound in measles throughout the world. Measles was a disease that was more or less eradicated, and now it's come back, and it's quite a harmful disease. You don't want to get measles. This case of scientific misconduct will have implications this year when the COVID-19 vaccine is released. Many people in the US and Canada are wary of taking this vaccine because they believe that there's a link between vaccines and illness when there actually is no link. And again, this whole idea was really fueled by this one case of scientific misconduct. So if we were going to replicate Milgram's experiment, how would we do it? Well, Milgram's experiment was actually replicated in 2009. Jerry Berger, a psychologist at Santa Clara University in California, ran the replication in collaboration with ABC News, and that's why we have footage of the experiment. He successfully replicated Milgram's result, so he found something that was conceptually similar. I'll show you a video of Berger's replication.
As you move up the scale, he begins to scream out in pain.
The experiment requires that you continue.
The experimenter pressures you to go on. Would you agree to continue?
That's all.
45 years ago, Dr. Stanley Milgram came up with this experiment to test whether people would blindly follow the orders of an authority figure. He found that 2/3 of his subjects were willing to give the most dangerous shock on the machine. We teamed up with Dr. Jerry Berger, a social psychologist at Santa Clara University in California, to see whether people have changed since then.
Wrong. 90 volts.
The typical response is to turn toward the experimenter and, if not say something, at least give a look that says, what should I do?
In our new experiment, how many people would agree to follow the orders of an authority figure?
Ow. That's incorrect.
39-year-old Troy Shasker is an electrician. He's been paid $50 to participate and told that the money is his to keep even if he quits the experiment early. He's worried about the dangers of the electroshock machine.
Wow. I don't think I could shock him that hard if he really does screw up. That's been a severe shock there.
Yeah, there are 25.
I could just go get my shotgun.
There are 20.
In the room next door, Troy watches as the learner gets strapped into his chair and really gets nervous once he hears him say this.
I should probably bring up, a couple of years ago at Kaiser, they diagnosed a mild heart condition. I'm really not too worried about it. It's not that serious. But
Well, you should know that while the shocks that we'll be using today may be painful, they're not dangerous. Okay?
Milgram intended that scripted exchange to set up a conflict in the subject's mind, a choice between the health of the learner and the authority of the experimenter.
Number 1.
Then the test begins.
Blue, boy, girl, grass, hat.
The learner must decide which of the 4 words is the correct match. At first, everything goes smoothly.
Correct.
I was confident that he was doing really good at first, and then it started looking bad.
Then, at 75 volts, Troy hears the first sign of trouble.
Soft, rug, pillow, hair, grass. Incorrect. 75 volts.
I could actually hear him next door going, ow, oh, and he kept getting things wrong.
Incorrect. 90 volts.
At 105 volts, he's clearly uneasy.
I got a little moist on my forehead there. I wasn't comfortable. I can't tell you why I listened to him and kept going. I should have just said no.
The correct word was duck. Rock, house.
At 150 volts,
Incorrect. 150 volts.
That's all.
will Troy listen as the learner begs him to stop, or will he follow Brian's orders?
Tell me the correct word, pair of white.
The correct word was white horse.
And the next item, please continue.
The next item is sad.
He obeys the orders.
Face.
Why didn't you stop?
I saw him getting strapped in, and they were just like little. I mean, he could have just, if he was in that much pain, he could have just tore himself off.
Why are you putting it on him and not you or the experimenter?
I was just doing my job. I was doing what I was supposed to do.
75 volts.
So I guess the influence of having the conductor of the experiment right there next to me, telling me to keep going, had a lot to do with it.
For the past 30 years, there have been severe restrictions on using humans in social psychology research. To avoid putting subjects under too much stress, Dr. Berger made a significant change to our experiment. In this experiment, you stopped at 150 make-believe volts. In Milgram, they went much higher.
We stopped for ethical reasons. We couldn't put people through the agony that Milgram's participants went through.
So as Berger described, he made some changes to the study to make it ethically more sound. So one of the changes that he made that he didn't talk about was that he excluded individuals who might have a negative reaction to the experience. So he pre-screened participants to make sure that there weren't any participants in the study who had anxiety or depression or schizophrenia or some other psychological disorder that might be exacerbated by stress. He's basically selecting people who can deal with stress. Now, participants were told twice that they could withdraw and still receive compensation. And importantly, as Berger mentioned, the shock didn't exceed 150 volts. So the point in Milgram's study where people either dropped out or went on. And that's an important control because it never got to the point where participants were causing or thought they were causing real deadly harm to the learner. Within seconds of the study ending, the learner entered the room and told participants that they had been deceived. So participants were fully debriefed. So I think this is a nice example of how we can take an older study that had arguably unsound ethics and replicate it to get more or less the same results in an ethically sound way. So we've come to the end of the lecture, which means we will have a very brief 3-question lecture quiz. Again, the point of these quizzes is just to assess how much of the lecture you've absorbed. Question 1, how do we ensure that psychology studies are conducted ethically? I'll give you about 30 seconds to jot down some answers. How do we ensure that psychology studies are conducted ethically? We weigh the risks and benefits, we get informed consent, and we guarantee anonymity and confidentiality. True or false? The researcher alone decides whether the benefits of a study outweigh the risks. 30 seconds. Actually, that's a true or false question, so I'll just give you 10 seconds. True or false, the researcher alone decides whether the benefits of a study outweigh the risks. This is, of course, false. All studies must be reviewed by research ethics boards. known as REBs. Third and final question, true or false. Once informed consent is given, participants must do their best to complete the study. True or false, once informed consent is given, participants must do their best to complete the study. This is, of course, false. So participants can withdraw from a study at any time for any reason whatsoever, and that's perfectly fine. So the reading for next class is Module 2.4 in your textbook. If you would like to know more about Milgram's experiment and what it means, we talked about the ethics of it, but we didn't talk about the psychology of it really to any great extent. I highly recommend listening to Radiolab, The Bad Show, and the link is on the slide.